has spread relentlessly, humanitarian needs have deepened, and countless civilian lives have been shattered. Since the beginning of this year alone, the situation in much of the Kordofan and Darfur regions, as underscored by Under-Secretary General 𝗟𝗃, has deteriorated. In recent weeks, we have seen an alarming escalation of drone attacks across the 3 Kordofan states, leading to more civilian deaths and injuries and forcing families to flee their homes. According to the International Organization for Migration, over 1 million people are now displaced in the region. In North Kordofan, fighting around 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲, the state capital, continues as armed groups battle for control of key routes. These clashes are restricting the humanitarian and commercial supplies and increasing shortages and deprivation. South Kordofan has also seen intensified fighting and aerial attacks, particularly in and around the state capital Kadugli and the town of Dilling to the north. Analysis of the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification IPC indicates that famine conditions may be prevalent in both locations. Recent announcements were made that sieges in these locations had been broken. Convoys are now able to move from 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲 to Kadugli and Dilling, but humanitarian access along these routes remains unpredictable. Blue Nile has also witnessed an escalation of conflict, including another airstrike in Yabus and reports of displacement following recent violence. Madam President, in Darfur, communities still endure overwhelming hardship. Reports of airstrikes and drone attacks across the region continue. Earlier today, the International Independent Fact-Finding Mechanism for the Sudan issued a new report describing atrocities committed by the Rapid Support Forces in and around El Fasher in late October as, quote, indicators of a genocidal path, end quote. The most recent alert from the IPC confirmed that in December, acute malnutrition rates in Umbaru and Kernoy localities in North Darfur exceeded famine thresholds. Although these levels are not the same as a famine classification, malnutrition is of great concern. In Tawila, North Darfur, families continue to arrive seeking safety. Recently, more than 1,000 newly displaced people reached the locality, joining the 600,000 displaced people already living there in dire conditions. Earlier this month, a partner operating near the border with Chad reported 10 fatalities and many injuries due to drone strikes in Tina. These frontline responders continue to provide support in a hospital and in an overwhelmed transit camp just on the border with Chad. The humanitarian toll of the fighting is egregious. Once again, we remind all parties that they must protect civilians and ensure their essential needs are met. This includes taking constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects, allowing civilians mostly displaced multiple times to move to even safer areas, and allowing humanitarian relief to reach civilians in need safely. Madam President, over 12 million women and girls in this crisis within a crisis. Violence against women and girls in Sudan has reached catastrophic levels. Demand for life-saving prevention and response services has surged by 350% since the conflict began. You've heard from Under-Secretary General 𝗟𝗃. I'll stress again what she said. Sexual violence against women and girls has reached simplifyingly horrific levels, simply put. Documented cases have nearly tripled, and we know this is a fraction of the real scale, given the barriers to reporting. Partners have also witnessed a sharp rise in female genital mutilation, domestic violence, exploitation, and child and forced marriage. The IPC further warns that the number of children and pregnant and breastfeeding women estimated to face acute malnutrition has now reached 4.2 million people. The scale, severity, brutality of gender-based violence demand urgent international action to support survivors, prevent further abuse, reinforce protection services, hold perpetrators to account. Women-led organizations whom we salute are also facing mounting intimidation, movement restrictions, and threats that disrupt vital services. Protecting women and girls must remain central to any efforts to protect civilians in the Sudan. Madam President, in Sudan, health workers, humanitarian workers are risking their lives every day, working in the most challenging of all circumstances. 4 incidents in 10 days have left humanitarian personnel killed or injured as they were delivering life-saving food. The humanitarian community, as stressed by the humanitarian coordinator in her statement over a week ago, is outraged by the repeated attacks on the World Food Programme trucks, assets, facilities. Health facilities are also being targeted. The World Health Organization reported that in just 1 week this month alone, 3 health facilities were attacked in South Kordofan, killing 31 people, including women, children, health workers. Frontline responders are the backbone of our response, and yet they face the greatest risk of being killed or wounded as they try to support communities. These unacceptable attacks are often carried out with total impunity. Since the conflict began, some 130 humanitarian workers, nearly all of them Sudanese, have been killed. Aid workers and humanitarian assets must never be targets. Madam President, Sudan has been stripped of its essential lifeline. Basic services are nearing total collapse. Food is largely unavailable in markets in some parts of the country. Means of livelihoods are almost inexistent, and most health facilities have exhausted their medical supplies. Amid this hardship, our humanitarian partners continue to respond with unwavering dedication. Last year, partners reached 17.6 million people with humanitarian assistance, including nearly 1 million women and girls who received critical gender-based violence and reproductive health services. This year, as the fighting has turned deadlier for civilians, aid work organizations have also stepped up. In January, the UN and partners re-entered al-Fasher and delivered critical aid. In 𝗟𝗶𝘃, we are providing hot meals through community kitchens, for example. The Sudan Humanitarian Fund has allocated $2 million to scale up life-saving assistance to northern state, North Kordofan, and White Nile, following a recent visit from the humanitarian coordinator, Mr. 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲. In South Kordofan, a joint UN convoy with supplies for more than 130,000 people reached the cities of Kadugli and Dilling after being delayed for several weeks due to high insecurity. This we deem a significant breakthrough. Not enough, but we are trying. We acknowledge with appreciation the cooperation of the Sudanese and Chadian authorities in keeping the Adre crossing open for humanitarian operations. Madam President, our capacity remains strained. Just as needs reached unprecedented levels, we grapple with critically low funding. This year, we aim to reach more than 20 million people through our hyper-prioritized humanitarian response plan. But we need funding, we need it fast. At a pledging event hosted on 3rd February by the US government in Washington, D.C., the Emergency Relief Coordinator Under Secretary General Fletcher urged the international community to redouble its efforts to end this war and the unbearable suffering of the people of Sudan. We need a humanitarian truce and unfettered access to reach people in need across conflict lines and borders. Under Secretary General Fletcher called for a re-energized effort to fully fund the humanitarian response plan. This includes support for air assets, medivac, medical evacuations, logistics, and other enabling assets that are critical for our humanitarian operations. Today, I call on this Council to act with urgency in 3 areas. First, use your influence to urge the parties to respect international humanitarian law and protect civilians across Sudan. Second, ensure that humanitarians, including local partners who are at the front lines, including women's groups, are protected and their work facilitated. Third, we ask the members of the Council and all other member states with influence to work together in pursuit of an immediate stop to the fighting, to stem the flow of weapons into Sudan, and to press for lasting, inclusive peace that the people of Sudan so desperately need. We welcome the ongoing efforts led by U.S. Senior Advisor for Arab and African Affairs, Mr. Boulos, together with the Quad, to secure a truce as a crucial step in this direction. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Masorno for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Hala Al-Karib.
President, Excellencies, thank you for the opportunity to brief you today. I'm Hala Al-Karib, a Sudanese woman human rights defender and Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, a grassroots feminist network. Like millions of Sudanese people, I have lost family members and my home as a result of the war. I have had the honor of speaking to the Security Council twice before. First, in September 2021, when I warned of the fragility of Sudan's democratic transitions, and again in October 2023, just 6 months after the war erupted, when I described its devastating impact on Sudanese women and girls and the growing risk of genocide. To be here a third time, only to report that the situation is even worse, is an indictment not just of the warring parties, but of the Council's inability to stop the bloodshed. Over 1,000 days since the start of the war, despite repeated warnings, this Council has failed to act. Every red line, siege, forced displacement, man-made famine, genocide, mass rape has been crossed. As we approach a point of no return in Sudan, I'm here with 2 messages. 1, every day this war continues, it destroys the lives and brutalizes the bodies of Sudanese women and girls. And 2, the war's atrocities that have already taken place during this war risks happening again, with civilians paying the price. For instance, the RSF atrocities in El Geneina or in El Fasher, where the scale of killing was so shocking that pools of blood were seen from the space. And now, Greater Kordofan and Blue Nile, where drone attacks by all parties are killing civilians and destroying hospitals, schools, and markets. The escalation of the conflicts is already destabilizing the entire region. Unless you act now, you will have more blood on your hands. Let me start with the first. Women, regardless of who they are, face systemic violence by all actors. They are targeted for their ethnicity, the color of their skin, being poor, their ability, their political affiliations, among other factors. Sexual and gender-based violence against Sudanese women and girls is a central feature of this conflict. Such violence, including rape, torture, enslavement, trafficking, detention, abductions, and killing, continues since the beginning of the war. We at 𝗟𝗶, we have documented over 1,294 cases of conflict-related sexual violence against women and girls, perpetrated primarily by the RSF and their allies. In Darfur, the RSF and their allies have deliberately targeted women and girls from the four Masalit, Berti, Zaghawa, and Tanjur communities on the basis of their ethnicity. As the UN fact-finding mission confirmed in a report today that this is part of a strategy of genocide aimed at eradicating native African communities, one that we as civil society have seen in Darfur for decades and have warned you about it for years. We fear that the RSF will continue their genocidal violence throughout Greater Kordofan and Blue Nile. Sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, and enforced disappearance of women in areas under RSF control remain severely under-documented due to the RSF deliberate restrictions of access, targeted communications blackout, and retaliation against those who speak out. Still, we know that thousands of women and children have been detained in villages of Garne, Turra, and Tabit in North Darfur, and that the RSF has turned hospitals, schools, and other sites into detention centers. Forced and child marriage to RSF soldiers is also frequently linked to abductions and enforced disappearances. The suffering of Sudanese women does not end by escaping to safer areas. After the RSF is driven out of a specific region, they must still contend with entrenched legal discrimination. Between August 2024 throughout December 2025, we received reports of more than 840 women being detained by local police, military intelligence in areas controlled by Sudan armed forces, including Wad Medani, Khartoum, Gadarif, Port Sudan, Dalanj, Kadugli, and Al-Lubayt. Many of these women are accused of being RSF collaborators, often based solely on their ethnicity or the fact they were unable to escape when the RSF took control. Women detained by Sudan armed forces are frequently subjected to degrading treatment, including ethnic slurs and physical assault during interrogation, and lack the means for legal representation to contest their detention. The collapse of the healthcare systems means that survivors of sexual and gender-based violence lack adequate medical care and psychosocial support. Without access to necessary sexual and reproductive health care, including post-rape care, women are dying of hepatitis, HIV and AIDS, syphilis, and other STIs. Without access to emergency contraceptions and safe abortion, survivors are forced to carry unwanted pregnancies to term. Even women volunteers and frontline workers who are instrumental in assisting survivors are being targeted, killed, detained, or forcibly disappeared. This horrific sexual violence has not only destroyed lives, it has ripped apart our communities. This brings me to my second point. None of this will stop without immediate action from you, the international community. Excellencies, unchecked external interferences in this conflict allow these atrocities to continue. The panel of experts and international NGOs have documented the flow of weapons and military equipment into Darfur, including by the United Arab Emirates, in violation of this Council's arms embargo. You can stop the violence by pressuring the RSF powerful backers with economic, political, and criminal consequences. This Security Council must act immediately to stop the violence in Sudan by taking the following actions. Demand an immediate cessation of hostility and targeting of civilian and civilian infrastructure, including the use of starvations and sexual violence as weapons of war. Demand the release of all civilians held by warring parties, particularly women held by the RSF in conditions amounting to sexual slavery. Deploy a mission with a clear mandate to protect civilians across Sudan, especially Darfur, in collaboration with the African Union. Call on all member states to immediately cease armed transfers that risk being used to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, including sexual gender-based violence. Expand the arms embargo to the whole Sudan and hold violators accountable, including through targeted sanction, and stop Sudan from being a playground for regional actors. Demand safe, immediate, and sustained humanitarian access. Condemn all assaults on aid delivery, including the recent attack on the World Food Programme convoy in North Kordofan. Urgently provide support and resources to Sudanese women-led organizations, including emergency response rooms, so they can continue their life-saving work. Hold all perpetrators accountable for genocides and other international crimes, including all forms of gender-based violence. Support accountability efforts, including the ongoing work of the International Criminal Court, and call on all parties to allow access for independent monitors and investigators, including the independent fact-finding missions on Sudan. This war aims to strip women of their agency. You must therefore ensure that Sudanese women in all their diversity are meaningfully included in all efforts to resolve the conflict. This Council must do everything in its power to prevent further atrocities and to ensure that Sudan is not forgotten. I urge you to meet more frequently, to focus attention on Sudan, consider a country visit, and include women's rights in all your decisions on this conflict. Most importantly, you must ensure that any end to this conflict does not come at the expense of accountability or respect for international law, and it is overseen by the United Nations. Excellencies, as you seek solutions to the war in Sudan, I urge you to remember that I, like thousands of other Sudanese women and men, have dedicated my life to challenging oppression and dictatorship. We have repeatedly proven that we can lead Sudan's struggle for peace and democracy. The future of Sudan must be written by its own people. Thank you for listening.
I thank Ms. 𝗟𝗶𝘃 for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs for the United Kingdom. Colleagues, 2 weeks ago I stood in Adre on the Chad-Sudan border, a camp of over 140,000 people who have fled Sudan's conflict, and 85% of them are women and children. Women I met who were teachers, nurses, students, small business women, market traders, mothers back home, but whose lives and whose families have been ripped apart. I spoke to a mother who didn't know whether her children are still alive. A Sudanese young woman who told me that most women she knew had experienced what she described as bad violence that no one wanted to talk about because of the shame. A Sudanese community worker who told me that she thought more than half the women in the camp had been subjected to sexual violence. And other communities workers who have told me yet more distressing stories. One about 3 sisters arriving at one of the Sudanese emergency response rooms who had all been raped. The oldest sister was 13. The youngest was 8. There is a war being waged on the bodies of women and girls. And I told the women that I spoke to in 𝗟𝗃 that I would bring their voices and their stories to the United Nations and to the world. And that is what we are doing today, because the world must hear the voices of the women of Sudan and not the military men who are perpetuating this conflict. Voices that ensure that this council confronts the bitter truth, because the world has been catastrophically failing the people of Sudan. This is the worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, a war that has left 33 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 14 million people forced to flee their homes, famine stalking millions of malnourished children, and a conflict that is embedded in vested interests and regional rivalries, with implications that go far beyond Sudan's borders. Yet too often the world has looked away. We must shine a spotlight on the suffering in Sudan. And that is why, in the Human Rights Council in November, the UK led work across countries to commission the fact-finding mission into 𝗟𝗏 and the siege and capture of the city by the RSF. And that report is now published today, and I'm bringing its evidence and conclusions before this Security Council. There's page after page of the most distressing accounts imaginable. It is horrific. Quotes which say, survivors consistently spoke of widespread killings, including indiscriminate shootings, point-blank executions of civilians in homes, streets, open areas, or while attempting to flee the city. A pregnant woman was asked how far she was in her pregnancy. When she responded 7 months, he fired 7 bullets into her abdomen, killing her. Hospitals, medical personnel, the sick and wounded were not spared. And survivors reported being raped in front of their relatives, including their children. Ethnic targeting calls for, as it says, extermination. So why are we here in this council when we see a report that concludes that it bears the hallmarks of genocide? With this council, this mandate, its purpose is to confront such shocking crimes and to drive action, because 𝗟𝗏 should have been a turning point. Instead, the violence now is continuing. More than 3 months after the fall of 𝗟𝗏, we continue to hear and see reports of continued violations of international humanitarian law or human rights abuses unfolding, aid agencies still facing barriers to get in, schools, hospitals, markets, humanitarian convoys being destroyed, 4 attacks on the World Food Programme since the start of this month alone. There have been reports of strikes on aid operations by both RSF and SAF, and the real risk of further escalation now across Sudan and beyond as fighting spreads to the Kordofan regions. This is not just a humanitarian crisis, it is a regional security crisis and a migration crisis too. We have seen the impact for regional security on neighbouring countries, on the whole of the Horn of Africa and along the Sahel. Opportunities for extremists to exploit and terror groups to take hold, and millions displaced from their homes, the risk of increased migration, destabilising nations nearby, but also across and into Europe as well. This affects all of us. And that is why we need action, and we need the United Nations to be a force for countries to come together from across the world to demand peace. First, it means demanding unimpeded humanitarian access and far greater humanitarian support, protection for civilians and for aid workers. Both warring parties must lift the restrictions on aid. The UN 2026 appeal is just 13% funded, leaving frontline agencies without the funding that they need to save lives. The UK is the third largest Sudan donor, providing $200 million this year, plus $54 million for Sudanese refugees. And in Chad, I announced a further $27 million to support survivors of sexual violence. But aid alone won't stop this. We need an immediate humanitarian truce and a pathway to a permanent ceasefire. So I commend the work of the US and President Trump's special advisor, who has convened the Quad of Nations with Egypt, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to discuss plans for peace, and the commitment from the Quintet, from the African Union and the European Union and others to support plans for peace. But we will need pressure from every UN member state, and I urge all of those with influence on both the RSF and the SAF not to fuel further conflict, but instead to exert maximum pressure on them to halt the bloodshed, to pull back and to pursue a plan for peace. A plan which includes rebuilding Sudanese civil society, supporting civil society groups and a civilian transition, because it should be the people of Sudan who determine Sudan's future. And that means we also need an end to the arms flows. There is no military solution to this conflict. But the reason that the military men still convince themselves there is a military solution is because they can still obtain ever more lethal weapons. External support from at least a dozen states, funding, manufacturing, transit, training, that is perpetuating the conflict and the misery. The fact-finding mission has said that it will report back further on investigations into breaches of the UN arms embargo into Darfur. But arms restrictions need to be enforced and extended. So again, I appeal to all nations. Now is the time to choke off the arms flows and exert tangible pressure for peace. And we need accountability. It is time for more sanctions against the perpetrators of these vile crimes. The UK has already sanctioned several senior RSF commanders linked to the atrocities committed in El Fasher. And this week we joined the US and France in proposing they be designated by the UN Security Council too. And we are confronting impunity by supporting the ICC's Sudan investigation so we can bring perpetrators to justice. Last September, at the UN General Assembly, the energy and the determination in this Security Council, but right across the UN, around the peace process for Gaza, rightly, was immense. And we could see and feel countries across the world coming together, countries who normally disagree, coming together to back a peace process. That is what made it possible for the US-led plan to deliver a ceasefire within weeks. We need that same energy and determination that we have rightly brought to the peace process in Gaza now to bring peace for Sudan, so we can secure an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian truce, and so that those responsible for atrocities are held to account. Let this be the time that the world comes together to end the cycle of bloodshed and to pursue a path to peace. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of A3, namely the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Liberia, and my own country, Somalia. At the outset, we thank United Kingdom for convening this important high-level meeting at the critical juncture for Sudan. We thank the Under-Secretary General, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, and Director Adam Wosorno for their sobering and timely briefings. We also take note of the intervention by Ms. Hala Al-Karib, whose testimony reminds us of the human dimension of this conflict. What's unfolding in Sudan is not only a humanitarian emergency, it's a collapse of protection a collapse of accountability, and increasingly a collapse of hope for millions of civilians trapped in violence they did not choose. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate at an alarming pace. Millions face acute hunger, displacement, and breakdown of essential services. Entire communities remain cut off from assistance. Famine conditions are no longer a distant risk. They are an imminent reality for many. In this regard, we welcome the high-level humanitarian conference for Sudan held in Washington in February of 2026, which mobilized a critical pledge to support life-saving operations. We commend the leadership of United Nations, including UN OCHA and its humanitarian partners, as well as WFP and other agencies who continue to operate under extraordinary, dangerous conditions. We stress in the strongest terms the importance of protecting civilians, critical infrastructure, humanitarian personnel, and facilities. The targeting of humanitarian operations and civilian infrastructure is unacceptable. We condemn the attacks on humanitarian assets, including the recent attack on the World Food Programme convoy attributed to RSF elements, which further undermines the already fragile humanitarian lifelines. Humanitarian actors must be able to operate safely, rapidly, and without obstruction. This requires not only access, but resources. The scale of suffering demands a substantial and sustained increase in humanitarian funding commensurate with the gravity of the crisis. In this context, in observance of the holy month of Ramadan, we underscore the urgent need for a cessation of hostilities which will allow humanitarian assistance to reach those in need and provide a much-needed respite to civilians who have endured immense suffering. The values of this sacred time, peace, mercy, unity, should guide all efforts toward de-escalation. We urge restraint and the silencing of gun and actions that honor the spirit of Ramadan. Madam President, accountability must remain central. Credible and independent findings, including satellite-based documentation and investigative reporting, have confirmed widespread atrocities. Civilians have been deliberately targeted. Entire communities have been subjected to systematic violence. A3 condemns, in the strongest terms, the atrocities committed by the rapid support forces, including the mass killing, the sexual violence, attacks against civilians, and other grave violations of international law. When truth can be documented from orbit, when destruction is visible from the sky, then impunity on the ground becomes indefensible. This Council cannot remain passive in this face of such evidence. We encourage ongoing efforts within the Council to activate its tools, including the sanction regimes established under Resolution 1591 to promote accountability and deter further violations. Madam President, there is no military solution to this conflict. Only dialogue, political engagement, and Sudanese-led process can lead to a sustainable peace. In this regard, A3 welcomes the presentation of the Sudanese National Initiative for Peace by the Prime Minister of the Transitional Government of Sudan before this Council on December 22, 2025, as an important step towards Sudanese own pathway out of this crisis. We also welcome the reopening of the Khartoum airport and the return of the government to the capital, which represents important development toward restoring state institutions and normalcy. We commend the continued diplomatic engagement of regional and international partners, including the efforts of the United States, the Arab Republic of Egypt, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in facilitating a dialogue. We further underscore the central role of the African Union in coordination with the United Nations, including the efforts of the Secretary General's personal envoy. Ensuring the complementarity, coherence, and streamlining of mediation tracks remains essential to advancing a unified and effective political process. Madam President, external interference continues to fuel and prolong the conflict. The instruments of destruction we see in Sudan, the drones, the weapons, and ammunition, are not produced within Sudan. They are supplied and sustained by external actors whose actions have contributed directly to the continuation of the violence. This Council must do its part to halt these flows, deter further external interference, and ensure accountability for those who enable the continuation of this conflict. Madam President, the suffering of Sudanese people is no longer hidden. It's visible, it's documented. It's undeniable. The Sudanese people deserve protection. They deserve accountability. They deserve peace. A3 remains committed to supporting all efforts towards these objectives. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of...
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, I begin my address by thanking the United Kingdom for convening this meeting. I also thank Secretary 𝗟𝗃𝗲, USG 𝗟𝗃𝗲, and Director Wasono for the invaluable information that they have furnished us with on the situation in Sudan. I also wish to thank Director 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲 for her testimony, and I welcome the delegation of Sudan, whose representative is with us today. Colombia notes with grave concern the sustained worsening of the political and humanitarian situation in Sudan. Today has manifested itself as an increasingly severe food crisis that we had the opportunity to discuss only a few days ago. Only decisive, resolute action will be able to counter the increasing loss of life and fight the continued and ever speedier worsening of life for the civilian population. Today we meet once again to continue to hear how the situation is worsening in regions such as El Fasher, Kordofan and Darfur. The picture is horrifically bleak. Food security is worsening. In addition, we're seeing internal displacement, which continues on a massive scale. The combination of hunger, scant medical care, and damage to infrastructure creates a situation in which the life of millions of people depends on an immediate, sustained and unfettered humanitarian response. Consequently, the Council must demand that urgent measures be taken to uphold and enforce international humanitarian law and to ensure the effective protection, safe passage and safe transit of civilians, as well as the cessation of attacks on personnel tasked with the delivery of humanitarian aid. Colombia is particularly concerned by the situation of women, girls, boys and adolescents. Moreover, we are gravely concerned by the alarming reports issued by humanitarian organizations. These state that more than 12 million people have been displaced, more than half of them women and girls. These reports also state that gender-based violence has intensified to an alarming extent. We're also seeing systematic forms of sexual violence used as a weapon of war. Colombia condemns this situation and here issues an urgent appeal for political and humanitarian responses to incorporate an intersectional gender-based approach. These policies must recognize women in their full diversity. They must guarantee their full, equal, meaningful and safe participation in peace and rebuilding processes. With first-hand knowledge of the horrors of conflicts and experience in building peace, Colombia understands that the participation of women paves the way for justice, reparation, repetition and reconciliation. We in no way claim to be a perfect model for the rest of the world to follow, but we do underscore the value of an inclusive peace, one which is built through dialogue. As such, we urge all members of the Council and actors in the conflict to step up their efforts to chart a course in this direction. It is not sufficient to describe suffering. We must act to halt the very same. History has taught us that peace is possible when there is national will alongside coherent and decisive international support. Only a genuine, inclusive and sustained political process can lay real foundations for de-escalation, the cessation of hostilities and a lasting peace. In this spirit, we urgently appeal to parties to carve out space immediately for dialogue and understanding. They must facilitate unimpeded humanitarian work and guarantee the effective protection of the civilian population. The longer we put off the search for a negotiated solution, the higher the human toll will be, and we will continue to witness in this room and outside its walls the deepening of the suffering of the Sudanese people and that of highly vulnerable communities. I thank you.
I thank the representative for Colombia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to warmly welcome you in your capacity as President of the Security Council and as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom. We thank you for your presence here today, which underscores the importance of the situation in Sudan and sends a clear signal of the Council's engagement at this critical juncture for the Sudanese people. I also thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Ms. 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲 for their comprehensive briefings, as well as the civil society representative 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲 for her most powerful testimony. I also wish to express our full support for the United Kingdom's efforts to advance a Security Council press statement for Sudan. We believe that the Council should speak with one voice at the critical moment. Madam President, allow me to underline three key aspects. First, Greece strongly condemns the recent drone attack on World Food Programme contracted trucks in North Kordofan, which were delivering life-saving assistance to displaced families near 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲, resulting in loss of life, injuries, and the destruction of essential supplies. We're equally alarmed by the earlier strike near a WFP facility in Blue Nile State. We note with grave concern that the very recent escalation of drone strikes, particularly as these attacks have resulted in civilian casualties, including children, compounding an already dire humanitarian situation. Attacks targeting humanitarian personnel and infrastructure are unacceptable and may constitute war crimes. All parties must ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, safeguard aid operations, and guarantee rapid, safe, and unhindered access across the country. We equally condemn in the strongest possible terms attacks against civilians, including through drone strikes, resulting in the killing and displacement of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Perpetrators of atrocities against civilians in El Fasher must be held accountable. Second, the food security situation has reached catastrophic proportions. The expansion of famine-level conditions in additional localities with acute malnutrition rates approaching 53% in Numbaru and 34% in Kernoi signals the dramatic proportions of the crisis. Famine has already been confirmed in Zamzam, El Fasher, and Kadugli. In 2026, nearly 4.2 million children under 5 and pregnant or breastfeeding women are projected to suffer from acute malnutrition, including up to 800,000 children facing severe acute malnutrition, the deadliest form of hunger. With much of the health system collapsed due to conflict and insecurity, life-saving treatment remains out of reach for vast segments of the population. The international community must urgently increase humanitarian funding and strengthen diplomatic efforts to protect civilians and facilitate access. Without swift and coordinated action, the human toll, especially among children, will continue to rise. We acknowledge Quad's commitment and we welcome the presence of the U.S. Senior Advisor for Africa, Mr. Boulos, in this meeting. And we take note of the Quintet joint statement of the 11th of February and we support its call for an immediate halt to further military escalation. We express our strong support for the efforts of the Quintet to facilitate dialogue, advance a nationwide humanitarian truce, and promote a credible pathway toward a sustainable and inclusive political solution in Sudan. The intensification of hostilities, including the use of increasingly destructive methods of warfare, continues to exact a heavy toll on civilians, particularly in Kordofan and Blue Nile, as we have heard today. With Ramadan having started, we encourage renewed and coordinated efforts to secure a humanitarian truce in line with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2736, as an immediate step towards a broader de-escalation. Madam President, humanitarian relief, while essential, cannot substitute for a political solution. There is no military path to lasting peace. Greece remains firmly committed to Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and reject the establishment of parallel governance structures in areas controlled by the RSF. A Sudanese-owned, comprehensive, and inclusive political process remains the only viable path towards stability and recovery. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome Secretary of State Cooper as you preside over this meeting, and thank USG 𝗟𝗃, Director Worsening, and Madam 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲 for their briefings. It has been nearly 3 years since the conflict erupted in Sudan, inflicting immense suffering on the country and its people. The international community must not allow the conflict to continue spreading, nor can it accept further civilian casualties. China calls on the international community to uphold the following 5-point consensus in a collective effort to seek a lasting and effective solution to the Sudan conflict. First, uphold the consensus on achieving a ceasefire as soon as possible. The international community should urge all parties to the conflict to prioritize Sudan's overall national interests and the long-term well-being of its people, heed the strong calls from the region and the broader international community, and realize a cessation of hostilities without delay. The tragedy in 𝗟𝗏 remains a stark reminder that such events must never be allowed to recur. External forces should stop providing military support, refrain from fueling the conflict, and must not seek to profit from the turmoil. Second, uphold the consensus on alleviating the humanitarian crisis. China strongly condemns attacks against civilians, civilian facilities, and United Nations personnel. All parties to the conflict must strictly abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law and provide special protection to vulnerable groups, including women and children. The Sudanese government's continued opening of artery crossing point and its adoption of several measures to improve humanitarian access should be assessed by the international community in an objective and impartial manner. Humanitarian issues must not be used as a tool for political pressure. The international community should scale up assistance, responsibly honor their funding pledges, and help Sudan as well as neighboring countries hosting large numbers of refugees strengthen their humanitarian response capabilities. Third, uphold the consensus on strengthening mediation efforts. The UN should play a leading role in mediation, while regional organizations such as the African Union, the League of Arab States, and IGAD should enhance coordination and build synergy to help the parties to the conflict return to dialogue and negotiations as soon as possible. Countries with direct influence over the parties should make greater efforts to bridge divides and foster mutual trust, and must refrain from turning Sudan into an arena for geopolitical rivalry. All mediation processes must respect Sudan's concerns and ensure the meaningful participation of the country concerned. Fourth, uphold the consensus of a Sudanese ownership. The history of Sudan's political transition has shown that improper external interference and imposition of externally crafted solutions are ill-suited to local conditions and may even exacerbate tensions. Ultimately, the key to resolving the Sudan issue lies in the hands of the Sudanese people themselves. Prime Minister Idris' Sudan Peace Initiative can serve as a foundation for launching an inclusive dialogue. All parties should effectively uphold Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, support a Sudanese-led political transition, and oppose the establishment of a parallel governance structure or any other actions that could lead to the fragmentation of the country. Fifth, uphold the consensus on integrating development and security. President Xi Jinping has emphasized that security is the prerequisite for development, and development provides a guarantee for security. Sustainable development is the fundamental and long-term solution to addressing the root causes of conflict. China supports the Sudanese government in seizing the opportunity presented by the relocation of the capital back to Khartoum to repair infrastructure and public services, facilitate the reception and resettlement of returnees, strengthen public security administration, advance the rule of law, thereby continuously improving people's livelihoods and well-being. The world should increase targeted investment in agriculture, industry, health, education, and infrastructure, among others, to help Sudan steadily resume national reconstruction and development. President, as Muslims around the world, including in Sudan, observe Ramadan, a month that in Islamic culture symbolizes peace, tranquility, and tolerance, we renew our call for all parties to the conflict to immediately cease hostilities and allow the Sudanese people a peaceful and serene Ramadan. China stands ready to work with the world to continue playing a constructive role in helping Sudan achieve lasting stability, development, and prosperity. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, first and foremost, I wish to welcome your presiding over our work today once again. I wish to thank the Undersecretary General, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, the Director of a Crisis Response Division of OCHA, Madam Eremu Sornu, as well as Madam Hala Al-Karib, for their briefings and for the important information that they have shared with the Security Council. Madam President, for nearly 3 years now, war has been ravaging Sudan in an escalating cycle of violence and atrocity. Thus far, all of the efforts to bring this to an end have failed to bear fruit. The result, as we have heard, is, among other things, an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. In this context, I wish to emphasize 3 points. First and foremost, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire throughout all of Sudan. So for nearly 3 years now, the SAF and the RSF, with support from allied militias, have been gaining the upper hand, one after the other. And yet, and this is quite clear, it is unrealistic on both sides to think that it is even possible to prevail with the use of weapons. Sooner or later, the belligerents will have to lay down their weapons and hostilities and negotiate. The persistence of hostilities is merely worsening the suffering of the Sudanese people and raising risks for the country's partition. France condemns in the strongest terms the violations of international humanitarian law, which are being perpetrated by the RSF, during the taking of El-Fasher in North Darfur, which may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. That is the thrust of the joint declaration published on 18 February last, where we condemn the violence and atrocities perpetrated against civilians, in particular against women and children, as well as all violations of international humanitarian law. Madam President, France, together with the United Kingdom and the United States, supports the sanctioning of the RSF generals whose responsibility for these crimes has been proven pursuant to the Darfur sanctions regime. Furthermore, France calls upon all states to end support for belligerents, which prolongs the conflict. We recall the importance of compliance with the arms embargo for Darfur. Turning to my second point, we have responsibility to address the humanitarian emergency. Speakers today have reminded us of the magnitude of the situation. France, together with Germany, the US, the United Kingdom, the EU, and the AU, will co-organize a donors conference on the 15th of April next to finance the humanitarian response plan and to deliver assistance to civilians. France calls upon parties to conflict to provide for safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance in all of Sudan, across borders and front lines. The delivery of convoys to conflict-afflicted areas is particularly important. Parties have an obligation to protect humanitarian personnel under international law and pursuant to Security Council Resolutions 2730 and 2286. France condemns all violence against civilians perpetrated by the RSF, the SAF, and their allied militias, specifically the very deadly drone strikes. Perpetrators of these crimes will have to be held accountable. Protection of civilians is an obligation incumbent upon parties under international humanitarian law and the Jeddah Declaration. We condemn in particular the uptick in conflict-related sexual violence. Turning to my third point, the Council needs to support diplomatic initiatives underway. We applaud the efforts of the United States and other members of the Quad to arrive at a humanitarian truce in the country. We support the efforts of the Quintet for Sudan, in particular those undertaken by the African Union to usher peace into the country. To conclude, in any event, a ceasefire needs to be followed up by inclusive inter-Sudanese dialogue, bringing together all parties to the conflict and Sudanese civil society in order to restore the possibility of a democratic, stable future in Sudan. We support all regional and international efforts which are geared towards facilitating such a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Foreign Secretary Cooper, I'd like to thank Ms. 𝗟𝗃 and Ms. Wosurno and Ms. 𝗟𝗃 for their valuable contributions. Foreign Secretary, your leadership has been instrumental in keeping Sudan at the forefront of international attention. We deeply value the United Kingdom's partnership and your clear commitment to working closely with the United States and the broader international community to help bring this crisis to an end. It's an honor to be here in the Council with you and so many distinguished members, including several partners and friends. As most of you know, under President Trump and Secretary Rubio's leadership and close direction, I'm helping to spearhead U.S. efforts to achieve peace in Sudan. Resolving the crisis in Sudan is a deeply felt concern of President Trump, and one that reflects our shared responsibility to the Sudanese people. Today, Sudan faces the biggest and gravest humanitarian catastrophe in the world. After more than 1,000 days of needless conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces, the toll is staggering. Over 12 million people have been displaced, making this the largest displacement crisis globally, with Egypt bearing the biggest burden of refugees, followed by Chad. More than 34 million people, that's over 72% of Sudan's population, require humanitarian assistance of some sort. Over 21 million Sudanese are acutely food insecure, with famine conditions confirmed in parts of Darfur, South Kordofan, and the risk of further spread. Hospitals have been destroyed or looted. Water systems have collapsed, and the entire communities have been cut off from aid. The actions of Sudan's warring parties have made much of Sudan nearly uninhabitable for its own people. Every day of continued fighting costs more innocent lives. The Sudanese people wake up daily to violence, hunger, and uncertainty. Entire cities have been reduced to rubble. Credible reports of mass killings, sexual violence, forced recruitment, and the obstruction of humanitarian aid are all too common across Sudan. Madam President, we must be clear-eyed and balanced in our assessment. There are no good actors in this conflict. Both the RSF and the SAF have committed serious human rights violations and abuses. Both bear responsibility for prolonging this war, deepening the suffering of their own people, and threatening to drag the broader region into conflict as well. In El-Fasher and across Darfur, we have seen credible reports of atrocities committed by the RSF, including ethnically targeted violence and siege tactics that exacerbate famine conditions. At the same time, there have been documented airstrikes and shelling by the SAF in densely populated areas, as well as arbitrary detentions and restrictions on humanitarian access. Accountability must apply to all perpetrators, regardless of affiliation. We must also acknowledge the destabilizing role of entrenched Islamist networks that have sought to exploit this conflict. Elements associated with the former regime and Islamist political movements, including figures tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, have worked behind the scenes to regain influence within state institutions and armed structures. These networks have fueled polarization, obstructed reform, and in some cases facilitated external support and arms flows that prolong the fighting. Let me be clear. Efforts by Islamist networks or any extremist political movement to manipulate this conflict, derail a civilian transition, or reassert authoritarian control will not be tolerated by the United States. We will use the tools at our disposal, including sanctions and other measures, to hold accountable those who enable violence, undermine democratic governance, or threaten regional stability. Madam President, this morning, the United States announced sanctions on the RSF commanders for human rights violations, including ethnic killings, torture, starvation tactics, and sexual violence. These individuals are now subject to asset freezes, arms embargoes, and travel bans. We have also imposed visa restrictions on another commander implicated in gross violations of human rights. These actions follow previous measures targeting actors linked to abuses on all sides, including Islamist networks that have fueled instability. Our message is consistent. Those responsible for atrocities, whether aligned with the RSF, the SAF, or any other armed factions, will face consequences. At the same time, accountability alone, as you said, Madam President, will not end this war. There's also no military solution to this conflict. Continued fighting will only fracture Sudan further and risk permanent state collapse, a grave threat to international peace and security. That is why we are working closely with partners in this room, including the United Kingdom, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and several others, to press for an immediate humanitarian truce and without preconditions. Such a truce must guarantee sustained, unhindered humanitarian access across conflict lines and borders. It is for this reason that we worked closely with the Secretary General's Office, DPPA, OCHA, and other UN offices to establish a mechanism, a UN mechanism, to support implementation, coordination, and supervision of the truce and humanitarian access commitments, so that agreements made on paper and obligations under international humanitarian law translate into assistance delivered on the ground. Madam President, just 2 weeks ago, together with allies and partners, we helped mobilize $1.5 billion in new pledges to the Sudan Humanitarian Fund, including a substantial portion from the United States, bringing the total U.S. contribution to $2.5 billion since the beginning of this crisis. But funding alone is not enough. If convoys are blocked, visas denied, and aid workers targeted, the fighting must stop so assistance can reach the tens of millions in need. Beyond an immediate humanitarian truce, we must recommit to a credible political process that can achieve a comprehensive political settlement and civilian transition. Sudan's future cannot be decided by generals. It must be shaped by civilians, by the doctors, teachers, youth leaders, women's groups, and community representatives who led the peaceful revolution and who continue to demand democratic governance. A sustainable resolution requires a transition to a civilian-led government that is inclusive, representative, and accountable, while preserving and reforming core state institutions so that the country does not descend into institutional collapse. It requires 5 things: restoring a strong constitutional framework, safeguarding national institutions from partisan capture, dismantling parallel patronage and militia structures, preventing extremist domination of the state. It also requires preparing for free and fair elections under international observation and ensuring that political competition takes place peacefully and transparently. Madam President, the international community must align behind 5 complementary pillars of engagement. First, achieving an immediate humanitarian truce, facilitating the full, safe, and unhindered flow of aid, while also establishing conditions that can lead to a permanent ceasefire. Second, there must also be coordinated efforts to ensure sustained humanitarian access, assistance, delivery, and civilian protection across Sudan, as the humanitarian crisis will persist well beyond the conflict. Third, we need to pursue a phased approach for negotiating a permanent ceasefire and security arrangements that will achieve a permanent and durable resolution of Sudan's conflict and that complements efforts for civilian dialogue and transition. Fourth, a structured political process that leads to a civilian-led transitional government that preserves state institutions and ultimately to democratic elections free from military or extremist domination. Fifth, this political track must be accompanied by a robust reconstruction and recovery effort. The international community stands ready to contribute to rebuilding Sudan's infrastructure, restoring essential services, once revitalizing the economy and supporting institutional reform once there's a credible civilian framework and a durable cessation of hostilities. Underpinning all of these pillars of engagement is also the need for justice and accountability for atrocities and violations committed by all parties, another area that is critical for sustainable peace and that will require significant international attention and support. The Sudanese people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience and courage. They deserve peace, they deserve dignity, and they deserve a government that answers to them, not to armed factions. The United States remains committed to working with all of you to end this tragic conflict and to support a peaceful civilian future for Sudan. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we are grateful to Undersecretary General, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, and OCHA Director for Crisis Response, Madam Adem Wosurnu, for their briefings. We listened attentively to the statement delivered by civil society representative, Madam Hala Al-Karib. Her statement served as a reminder for us about the tragedies that have been unfolding in El-Guinin, El Fasher, and in other cities, one after the other. And these tragedies have stark ethnic indications. We are indeed liable to face the establishment and outbreak of conflict within the current conflict. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the permanent representatives of Sudan, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. The armed conflict in Sudan is nearing an unfortunate 3-year anniversary. The situation in Kordofan states is restive. The armed forces are undertaking efforts to expel the insurgent forces from the major cities in the south of the country, including Kadugli and Diling. On the 18th of February, UN humanitarian personnel, for the first time after a 3-month blockade by the RSF, managed to deliver assistance to the residents of those cities. With varying degrees of success, but there have been the threats of emanating from the rebels in northern Darfur are being curbed, and the army opponents have established a foothold in that state, largely exploiting support being delivered contrary to the restrictions set out in the 1591 sanctions regime, against the backdrop of the countless atrocities being perpetrated by the rebels targeting civilians and the attempts of the armed forces to establish constitutional order. We see attempts to pin responsibility for these acts of violence on both sides of the conflict. The humanitarian situation in Sudan is far from ideal. A significant portion of the population needs assistance. Since the outbreak of the conflict, more than 4 million people have fled the country. Fewer than half of the pre-conflict number of medical institutions are still in operation. The vaccination levels have plummeted. There are outbreaks of communicable diseases. A little bit more than 1/3 of the humanitarian response plan has been covered last year, and there are proposals to cover this with individual country contributions. We recall the need for closer cooperation between humanitarian personnel and the government of Sudan. At the same time, potential difficulties which emerged during the conflict, these difficulties need to be resolved through orderly, multi-tier dialogue, as is being done by some of the humanitarian structure representatives from representatives in the country, rather than attempting to have this discussed at the council, an attempt to pin blame on somebody for the delays. We reject the manipulation of the topic of food security and protection of civilians in Sudan. There is a need to focus on meeting the priority food-related needs of the population to enhance, in conjunction with Khartoum, the effectiveness of the delivery of this assistance. The Russian Federation continues to deliver assistance to the friendly nation of Sudan in resolving these issues. By the end of last year, we delivered to the country 1.7 million tons of agricultural products. 90% of that is wheat. We frequently send Russian emergency ministry assistance to Sudan, and the authorities are doing a great deal in order to provide for tranquility in the regions in the country controlled by them. Also noteworthy is that according to the IOM, since the outbreak of conflict in Sudan, more than 3 million people returned, including 1.3 million to Khartoum and El Gezira. The government's plans for the phased return of government institutions from Port Sudan to the capital are heartening. There's a need to focus on assisting the Sudanese as they dig through the rubble and as they rebuild the damaged infrastructure in Khartoum. Calls in terms of mine clearance are also important. Madam President, the Russian Federation consistently advocates for a prompt ceasefire and a transition to a political conflict or political settlement to the conflict. We believe that the sole viable way towards peace is broad, inclusive, intra-Sudanese dialogue which is not imposed from the broad. Dialogue which takes into account the interests of all significant patriotically minded political and social forces of the country. Decisions about the future of Sudan need to be taken by the Sudanese themselves without external pressure nor any ready-made solutions. Unfortunately, for now, we do not see any prospects for political solutions. They are elusive. At the same time, we cannot state that the Sudanese themselves are not demonstrating focus on seeking them. On the contrary, the government, led by Prime Minister Kemal Idris, spoke out in December 2025 with a fully fleshed initiative for a comprehensive resolution, and at its heart is the roadmap, which was set out in 2025. This plan, regardless of certain views about this, is the only proposal for a peaceful resolution of the internal conflict, which has emanated from the Sudanese themselves. It has been duly appraised by African countries themselves, which has been reflected in the outcome document of the AUPSC dating 12 February. And it reflects the aspirations of the Sudanese themselves for the restoration of stability and security. There is a need to closely study this initiative. we regularly hear from certain members of the Council calls for more energetic action on Sudan and the need to bring about more promptly generate peaceful resolutions. Possibly a step in this regard would be a transition to frank, respectful, and equitable dialogue with the current authorities and support for their aspirations towards peace. There is a need to bear in mind that the current government remains a guarantor for the preservation of national institutions, stability, and security, and is able to facilitate the transition to civilian-led governance after the definitive normalization of the situation in the country. Attempts to create certain parallel governing structures are obstacles here. We welcome the fact that the Security Council has been categorically speaking out against such steps. The goal of the Security Council is to facilitate de-escalation and national reconciliation, not to deepen divisions. The Russian Federation stands ready to continue to constructively contribute to collective efforts to restore peace, stability, and unity in Sudan. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
At the outset, I would like to express our thanks to Her Excellency Ms. 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲, the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, for presiding over the Council's meeting today. And I would also like to welcome the Senior Advisor to the U.S. for Arab and African Affairs, Mr. 𝗟𝗏𝘃𝗏, and I would also like to welcome the participation of Their Excellencies, the ambassadors, today. We also thank the briefers and have listened carefully to the detailed insights into the escalating challenges in the sisterly Republic of Sudan. We also share the deep concern of others regarding the continued violence and the consequences for infrastructure and the lives of civilians, especially children and women, as well as the threats that target humanitarian supply routes, relief convoys, and medical facilities in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Madam President, I would like to address the following points. First, it pains us that the blessed month of Ramadan arrives while our brothers and sisters in Sudan continue to face extremely harsh humanitarian challenges. In this context, we join the call of the UN Secretary General urging all parties to de-escalate, cease hostilities, to end the suffering of civilians, and we emphasize the need to enable the Sudanese people to live in safety and dignity. And in fully keeping with the noble values embodied by this holy month, we call on all parties to engage in serious dialogue to lay the foundation for a political settlement, which will be an essential step in order to alleviate the civilian casualties and allow humanitarian assistance to enter. Second, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Sudan requires the international community, and in particular the Security Council, to uphold their responsibilities and take decisive action to ensure the unhindered and immediate delivery of humanitarian assistance in accordance with the Jeddah Declaration and the relevant resolutions and the applicable conventions. And we emphasize that all parties must comply to the provisions of protecting humanitarian personnel in accordance with the international humanitarian law. And with the increasing humanitarian needs, we commend the continued international efforts that aim to strengthen the humanitarian response in Sudan, including the pledging conference that was recently held in Washington and the donor conference scheduled to take place in Berlin in April. In this regard, we stress the importance of maintaining and building on this positive momentum, in particular through fulfilling the donor pledges and through enhancing support to the Sudan Humanitarian Fund, so that the fund may effectively and swiftly respond to the urgent needs of the most affected population groups across the Sudan, and so that the fund can continue to support host communities caring for refugees in neighboring countries. Third, we reaffirm the Kingdom of Bahrain's firm and consistent position in support of everything that supports stability in Sudan and that contributes to building its institutions and fulfilling the aspirations of its people. Accordingly, we commend the efforts undertaken by regional and international actors to end the conflict in Sudan by bridging the positions of the Sudanese parties and enabling them to reach a comprehensive and sustainable political solution. In this context, we take note of the communiqué issued by the African Union's Peace and Security Council on the 12th of February, and we support the Council's call for an immediate humanitarian truce that would lead to an urgent cessation of hostilities, and reaffirming that there can be no military solution to this conflict. We similarly value the outcomes of the 5th consultative meeting to coordinate the peace efforts hosted by Egypt on the 14th of January 2026, which aimed to support the political settlement in Sudan. The Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its appreciation for the good offices undertaken by the 𝗟𝗏 and the role of the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for Sudan and the efforts of the Quintet. And we underscore the importance of coordinating between the different initiatives to consolidate peace and security in Sudan, as well as regionally and internationally. Finally, the Kingdom of Bahrain stresses the importance of preserving the Sudanese state institutions and infrastructure and launching an inclusive Sudanese-led political process that ends the conflict and lays the foundation for a peaceful political transition through the formation of a civilian government that preserves the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Sudan. Thank you, Madam President.
The representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank Undersecretary 𝗟𝗃, Director worsening, and Ms. 𝗟𝗃 for their disheartening updates. Your briefings, as all the briefings we get on the situation in Sudan, embody the tragic duality of this conflict. Accounts so harrowing that they should be unimaginable, yet so recurrent that they risk becoming normalized. So let me therefore also thank Foreign Secretary 𝗟𝗃 for her presence today and for bringing the voices of the women of Sudan to the Council so that it is not normalized. Mr. President, as we've heard today, Sudan has become the world's largest humanitarian, hunger, and displacement crisis. This is the result of unbearable international crimes and grave violations of international law, including resolutions of this very Council. The level of brutality should shock the conscience of this Council and all Member States into action. Allow me to raise 3 points. First, there is no military solution to this conflict. The war has reached a dynamic stalemate. However, for Sudan's civilians, this agony is anything but static, especially the 𝗟𝗏, the current epicenter of violence. We strongly condemn the RSF's continued assault in the region and call on both the SAF, the RSF, and affiliated parties to halt the fighting. Denmark condemns in the strongest terms the systematic, deliberate, and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure, including health facilities, and the proliferation of drone attacks. Last week's strikes on a mosque and primary schools in 𝗟𝗏 are just some recent examples of the depravity of this violence. It is unbearable that in 2026, one must restate that such attacks are prohibited and morally reprehensible. We call upon all parties to the conflict to refrain from using starvation as a weapon of war. This is driven by deliberate attacks on humanitarian workers and the unlawful obstruction of humanitarian access at scale. Against this backdrop, we thank Senior Advisor Boulos for leading the Quad's efforts to achieve an immediate humanitarian truce, which is absolutely imperative and which we hope can be followed by a process that paves the way to a political solution. We encourage the warring parties to engage constructively with the Quad. We welcome the establishment of the AU-led quintet to enhance coordination of mediation efforts and to facilitate an inter-Sudanese political process. Second, as we heard from all our briefers today, women and girls continue to bear the brunt of this cruelty, often subjected to widespread sexual and gender-based violence. These persistent attacks are nothing less than a damning indictment on the perpetrators, but also on this Council and our mandate to protect the most vulnerable. We further recall that these acts may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. We call for full accountability for these crimes and call on all parties to cooperate with the International Criminal Court regarding the situation in Darfur as mandated by this Council. Any political initiative or peace plan must integrate from the outset the specific needs and protection of women and children and ensure the full, meaningful, and safe participation in shaping Sudan's future. Third, Mr. President, the war is spilling across borders, forcing millions to flee and straining neighboring host communities. External actors continue to finance, arm, and resource the warring parties. They are complicit in this catastrophe. We call on all states to immediately cease all forms of support and to uphold their obligations under international law, including on arms transfers in line with this Council's arms embargo on Darfur, which we believe should be extended to Kordofan and all of Sudan. In the face of such blatant disregard for the Council's resolutions, we should be ready to use all tools at our disposal. That includes additional restrictive measures against individuals and entities under an expanded 1591 sanctions regime. It also includes setting out our demands to the warring parties clearly and forcefully through a resolution. Mr. President, in closing, our briefers today sounded clear calls for action. The time for political courage is now, both from the parties and from this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo, OCHA Director Edem Wosornu, and Ms. Hala Al-Karib for their comprehensive briefings. We welcome the participation of the representatives of Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, UAE, and EU in the meeting today. President, as the briefers have highlighted, the situation in Sudan continues to deteriorate at an alarming pace. The expansion of hostilities into the Kordofan region following the catastrophe in Al-Fashir reflects another dangerous escalation. Particularly concerning are the sieges of major population centers, the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the deliberate use of increasingly sophisticated weaponry, and the growing spillover across borders, including along the Sudan-South Sudan border. It is the civilian population of Sudan that is paying the heaviest price of this conflict. Pakistan condemns in the strongest terms the atrocities committed by the Rapid Support Forces in Darfur, including in Al-Fashir and earlier in El Geneina, as well as the continued violence now unfolding in Kordofan. We reiterate that deliberate attacks against peacekeepers, United Nations personnel, humanitarian workers, and facilities are unacceptable and may amount to war crimes. Those atrocities must end, and those responsible must be held accountable. Pakistan's position on Sudan remains firmly anchored in the principles of the UN Charter. We reaffirm our unwavering support for the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Sudan. The preservation of a unified Sudan is essential, not only for its people, but also for the peace and stability of the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and the Red Sea region. President, at the same time, we stress that there is no military solution to this conflict, The only viable path forward lies in meaningful dialogue. We support the efforts and peace plan presented by the transitional Sudanese government. Interim Prime Minister Kamil Idris briefed this council in December on that plan. We also welcome the African Union Peace and Security Council's communique of 12th February in this regard. Pakistan stresses the importance of coherence and complementarity amongst the various political processes. The efforts of the African Union, the United Nations through the Secretary General's personal envoy, IGAD, Quintet, and other regional partners must be mutually reinforcing. The important engagement of the Quad should contribute to these broader objectives and help secure a humanitarian truce that can evolve into a ceasefire and result in eventual stability and lasting peace in Sudan. We call on all parties in Sudan to demonstrate the requisite flexibility and sagacity to reach a peaceful and sustainable settlement that preserves the unity of the country and prioritizes the interests and well-being of the brotherly people of Sudan. We stress that the Jeddah Declaration signed by the parties must be respected and civilians must be protected. President, the humanitarian situation remains dire and a cause of serious concern in Sudan. Humanitarian imperatives must remain central to the Council's work. Sustained, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to the affected areas of the country is essential. In this regard, coordination with the Sudanese government is indispensable for effective, predictable and large-scale delivery. The recent delivery of aid by the UN in South Kordofan with the assistance of Sudan's government is a welcome development. We call for an urgent scaling up of international funding for the humanitarian response, which remains severely under-resourced despite the immense needs. We welcome the recent conference convened by the United States to secure funding for humanitarian assistance to Sudan. Mr. President, the Sudanese people have suffered for far too long. The guns must fall silent and a credible political horizon restored. The Security Council must discharge its responsibility by supporting a unified, sovereign and stable Sudan and by advancing a coordinated political process that leads to peace. Pakistan will continue to work with all partners towards that end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank the United Kingdom for focusing this high-level meeting on Sudan and on Sudanese women. And I thank USG 𝗟𝗏 𝗃𝗏, OCHA Director, Ms. 𝗟𝗏 and Hala Al-Karib for their briefings exposing the gravity of the situation. Let me clearly reaffirm, Latvia stands with the Sudanese people, robbed of their democratic transition and now trapped in a war they did not choose. This conflict is tearing apart Sudan's social fabric and deepening grievances that will long outlast the fighting. Al-Fashir has shown what this war has become, its methodical cruelty. OHCHR has documented over 6,000 people killed in just the first 3 days of the RSF's final offensive on Al-Fashir in October last year. While individual acts constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, as we heard from the fact-finding mission, confirmed, the cumulative effects may indicate a path to genocide. And now the same brutality is echoing in Kordofan states. I would like to highlight 3 main messages from our side. First, protect civilians and let life-saving aid in. We call on the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces to cease hostilities immediately and to comply fully with the international humanitarian law. We're deeply alarmed also by the impact of growing drone warfare on both sides, on civilians. The UN reporting indicates that drone strikes in Greater Kordofan killed over 90 civilians, injured 142 between late January and 6 February alone. This week, another 57 civilians were killed. And these attacks may amount to war crimes. Now, in the face of the worst humanitarian crisis, we urge the parties to ensure safe, rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access. Aid must never be politicized or used as leverage. Aid is a lifeline, not a bargaining chip. Second, any peace plan must be built for a civilian future, not armed rule. It must be Sudanese-owned and lead to civilian-led transition, with a full, equal and meaningful participation also of women and youth. Respect for international human rights law is critical to that end, including protection of fundamental freedoms and due process. And this civilian space must operate within one Sudan. Latvia rejects any attempt to impose parallel authorities or fragment the country by force. Third, accountability. Accountability must be real, including for conflict-related sexual violence. Again, UN reporting describes rape being used as a weapon of war in 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲. On one day alone, 25th of October last year, 25 women at least were gang raped in only one day. A 14-year-old old girl was abducted and gang raped the day before. These are just two horrific examples, and we heard many more today. And this is going on. The ICC has also warned this Council that sexual violence, including rape, is being used as a weapon of war in Darfur. As Ms. Wosurno said, 12 million women and girls face a crisis and this crisis. And these are not numbers, these are human beings like us. More, there are alarming reports that in Khartoum and Blue Nile State, 2 women have been sentenced to death by stoning. This is incompatible with the international human rights law and against any norms of human dignity. So we call on Sudanese authorities to revise this decision immediately. To make accountability real, the UN country team's capacity to monitor, document and report human rights violations, including conflict-related sexual violence, must be strengthened. And where criteria met, perpetrators should face targeted listings, including under 1591 sanctions regime. A solution that poses violence while entrenching coercion and impunity will not hold. We've seen that in Sudanese history. So, Mr. President, external support continues to fuel this war, and both sides benefit from that outside backing. The flow of arms, financing, and other enabling assistance must stop. All states must comply with the relevant Council measures, including the arms embargo. And we do commend the efforts of regional and international partners, particularly the United States, the Quad, the Quintet, for humanitarian truce, to advance talks and bring parties to the table. And indeed, action by this Council is urgent to stop this, to protect Sudanese civilians, Sudanese women and girls from the systemic and brutal violence, to provide human access for starving populations, for starving children. So let us just do that, and with a united voice in this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful for the briefings issued by the Under-Secretary General, 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲, by the Director of the Crisis Response Division at 𝗟𝗃, Ms. Edem Wosurno, and by Hala Al-Karib, representing Sudanese civil society. We welcome the participation of Her Excellency Yvette Cooper, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, and we welcome the fact that under the UK presidency of the Security Council, Sudan has been established as a priority on cannot be analysed solely through the lens of military advances or territorial control. What we are seeing is a systematic campaign of violence against the civilian population, marked by the defenselessness of millions of people, the persistence of sexual violence as a weapon and tactic of war, the recruitment of boys and girls, and the deliberate use of hunger as a method of combat. When these patterns take root, they create conditions ripe for the commission of atrocity crimes on a massive scale. Regrettably, that was exactly what occurred in El Fasher. Some specific incidents of such brutality have today been very clearly described, tragically described indeed, and in very lucid terms by the Secretary of State from the United Kingdom in her commendable briefing. All of this is confirmed by the recent report of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the report published today by the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission for Sudan. The testimony emerging from Kordofan, Darfur and other affected regions reveal a persistent pattern of conflict-related sexual violence, particularly against women and girls. It is deployed to sow terror, to compel displacement, and to destroy the social fabric. These facts demand that there be urgent protection now given to women, and that we ensure their full, equal and meaningful participation in any political process. We must also guarantee immediate access to comprehensive services for survivors. We are gravely alarmed to note the critical escalation of the conflict, marked by the ratcheting up of hostilities, the persistence of weapons flows, and external interference. All of these undermine efforts aimed at bringing about de-escalation. Panama condemns in the strongest possible terms the repeated attacks against civilians, critical infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, and attacks against humanitarian assets, convoys, and personnel, including the recent attacks against the World Food Programme. These acts constitute grave violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate that parties must respect and protect humanitarian personnel and their aid in accordance with their international obligations and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. We underscore that deliberate attacks against civilians constitute war crimes. Panama wishes to sound the alarm at the situation of children in Sudan. According to data recently issued by the United Nations, around half of those in need of life-saving assistance are boys and girls. That is a reflection of a collective failure to protect the most vulnerable. We recognize the recent delivery of supplies by a UN convoy to Dilling and Kadugli. That delivery allowed assistance to be extended to more than 130,000 people. Such access must be sustained and not the exception. Humanitarian assistance must remain neutral, impartial, and independent. President, this Council must act coherently and with resolve. It must fully leverage all tools at its disposal, including targeted sanctions to guarantee accountability. Panama echoes what was said by the Secretary General at the recent African Union summit. He stated that all parties must commit to an immediate cessation of hostilities and resume talks aimed at achieving a lasting ceasefire and an inclusive political process which is led by the Sudanese themselves. We express support for mediation efforts currently underway, led by the Quad and by regional actors, with a view to achieving a humanitarian truce. An immediate cessation of hostilities for humanitarian purposes is critical to halt the suffering of the population. Moreover, we urge all member states to refrain from any form of external interference liable to fuel the conflict. We urge all to uphold their obligations under international law and to fully implement the relevant resolutions of this Council. President, more than 1,000 days after the eruption of the conflict, the situation in Sudan demands strategic coherence and political resolve. The magnitude of the crisis indicates that current conditions are not tenable or acceptable. The Sudanese people urgently needs effective protection, unfettered humanitarian access, and they need decent living conditions so that a viable political solution can begin to emerge. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sudan.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Mr. President, we would like to welcome your presidency of the Security Council during the current month of February. I also express my thanks to Mrs. 𝗟𝗏 𝗃𝗲, Under Secretary General for Political and Peace Building Affairs, and Mrs. 𝗟𝗏, Director of Operations and Advocacy at OCHA, as well as Ms. 𝗟𝗏, Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa. I'd like to thank them all for their comprehensive briefings, and we would like to thank Ms. 𝗟𝗏 for her strong briefing, which reflected the voice of the women in Sudan. Mr. President, the war of systemic aggression waged by regional and international forces is employing political activists allied with the Rapid Support Forces militia. This war has placed Sudan before a single choice, confronting an existential threat that is working like a plague to dismantle the Sudanese state. It's trying to eliminate the Sudanese armed forces through misleading and false narratives under the pretext of combating the Muslim Brotherhood, whose long rule was overthrown by the December 2019 revolution. Sudan today is engaged in a fierce war fought by its armed forces with significant support, backing, popular solidarity, and a uniquely resilient military steadfastness. The government of Sudan is now returning to Khartoum, engaging positively with AU, the UN, and regional organizations, resuming its activity within IGAD, and communicating with the international community and the United States. We're also keen to launch an inclusive national dialogue with all political and social forces. We welcome all those who distance themselves from the alliance of aggressors and align with a national position. We look forward to an end to this war of aggression targeting our people, as well as the cessation of the unprecedented atrocities and violations committed by the rebel militia against civilians, including ethnic genocide. The government of Sudan presented its vision for ending the war to this esteemed council in December 2025 when it was addressed by the Prime Minister. The Government of Hope continues its effort to build and make peace based on national ownership and in partnership with relevant sectors, civil society, women and youth. It's developing confidence-building measures, recovery and national reconciliation with the aim of achieving the Sudanese Peace Initiative, ending the rebellion, establishing a political settlement, and securing sustainable peace. This would enable a successful transition, whose ultimate objective is the holding of elections and ensuring the democratic choice of the Sudanese people. We're also working to contain the effects of the escalation of the armed conflict and the threat it poses to the unity of the state and to the map of societal and communal peace. This track complements the political process, but it's preceded with higher security arrangements of the post-war period. This approach seeks to address the root causes of protracted conflicts, promote a culture of civic legality and peaceful coexistence, as well as establishing the principle of the rule of law and community justice. For these are frameworks for transitional justice. It also aims to contain rebellious tendencies, hold the cycle of violence and hate speech, while engaging social actors, including leaders of traditional administrations, religious and Sufi leaders, academics, women, youth, and girls in the project of peace building and peacemaking according to the relevant Council resolution. This is in addition to voluntary return policies and reconstruction and rebuilding effort. We're trying to foster a Sudanese national identity reconciled with the realities of cultural and linguistic diversity. This is linked to building social peace and reforming the justice and security sectors in the post-war phase. And we're trying to do that through mobilizing support for a ensuring the flow of humanitarian assistance, mobilizing support for the civilian protection plan, opposing efforts aimed at establishing a parallel administration and a separate government, and supporting the transition from relief to recovery and reconstruction. Turning to the United States position, it is highly developed compared to the positions of other mediators. It reflects a greater degree of seriousness. This follows the commitments made by President Trump after his meeting with His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to end the war following the atrocities and ethnic genocide committed by the Rapid Support Forces militia. We support the U.S.-Saudi-Egyptian engagement aimed at ending the war, following the clear commitment of President Trump and the repeated statements by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio regarding pressure on the militia and its sponsors to halt arms shipments. At the legislative level, successive condemnations have been issued by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as by prominent members denouncing these atrocities, criminalizing them, calling for accountability and demanding the designation of the militia as a terrorist organization, and openly accusing those who provide militia with weapons and military equipment. In this regard, we appreciate the statements made by U.S. Secretary of State Rubio on the 12th of November 2025, in which he unequivocally condemned the RSF militia and rejected its narrative, affirming that the abuses and atrocities committed are at the hands of rogue elements. He further affirmed his support for the call by Congress to designate the militia as a terrorist organization, if doing so would contribute to ending the war. Accordingly, we value the Saudi-US-Egyptian initiative and seek to strengthen it until it achieves its objectives. We also follow and commend the effort of Mr. 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗲, who has remained in contact with the country's senior leadership. We call for practical steps, as referenced by Secretary Rubio, to cut off the flow of weapons and support received by the Rapid Support Forces militia. He noted in his statement that the designation of the militia could be considered if it would lead to ending the war. Sudan's channels will remain open at the highest levels regarding the implications and parameters of the Saudi-US-Egyptian initiatives. This is with the aim of halting external military interference, ensuring the uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian relief. And we have clarified to your Council before that there are cross-border points and airports provided by the government of Sudan, and Mr. Tom Fletcher commended those efforts. Therefore, we support the uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian relief. We support the protection of civilians from the militia's domination. And we call for the respect of international humanitarian law and international law. We hope that the United States will leverage its influence to ensure an effective mediation whose outcome strengthens the cessation of the war and repositions Sudanese-American relations within a new strategic partnership. It will be another achievement for President Donald Trump, who attaches great importance to the matter. Sudan remains committed to constructive engagement with the U.S. for peace. We call for bringing pressure to bear on the regional sponsors so that they can cease supplying the militia with military equipment. Ending external military interference must precede any other step. It is the key to stopping the war and to enhancing civilian protection. I would also like to thank Mr. 𝗟𝗏𝘃𝗲, advisor to President Donald Trump for African and Arab Affairs, for his endeavors and his relations with the Sudanese leadership and his effort to achieve peace and end the war in Sudan, as well as the donor humanitarian event on Sudan hosted by Washington on Tuesday, the 3rd of February. We also thank the U.S. for its pledge of a contribution of $200 million in support of Sudan's 2026 humanitarian needs and response plan. We also thank the states that have continued to support humanitarian work and relief effort in Sudan through bilateral or multilateral contributions. We thank Britain for their comprehensive statement today and their support to the women of Sudan, especially their contribution and commitment to end the war. We commend their positive stance since Mr. Cooper has assumed the position of Prime Minister, Mrs. Yvette Cooper, that is, in 2025, and the contribution of more than $146 million British pounds for the Sudan Humanitarian Fund. Turning to the food situation, Mr. President, since 2022, which witnessed the last field survey report based on scientific data collection and analysis, all subsequent reports issued during the war of aggression have amounted to assumptions lacking scientific accuracy, given the difficulty of obtaining information from affected populations across the various states of Sudan under siege by the rapid support forces. Sudanese civilians are not dying from famine in the scientific sense. Rather, they are dying due to the militia's intransigence, as it kills them in cold blood, employing systemic starvation and siege, as was stated in the Human Rights Council report recently issued. For it noted that the systemic use of starvation and siege is the main reason for the killing of civilians. This is a flagrant violation of Security Council Resolution 2417 and of Article 54 of the Additional Protocol of the Geneva Conventions. States neighboring Sudan that are aligned with the militia support this criminal approach in pursuit of a political agenda aimed at displacing civilians and transferring nomadic groups and perpetrators from the Sahel states to replace them. Sudan possesses the capabilities and resources that have enabled it to maintain food production during the war. This is confirmed by humanitarian organizations operating in Sudan, which procured from Sudan the largest share purchased in the region of food crops, such as sorghum, according to the testimony of the WFP in a meeting with member states at the end of the last war. The IPC has come to publish new reports periodically based on previous data and unsubstantiated projections without coordination with the Ministry of Agriculture in a manner that has altered its technical character. We have also tried to open corridors and border crossings during the war, such as the Adri crossing. The government has worked to increase emergency funding for food, health and water programs, while expanding coverage of programs for the treatment of acute malnutrition among children and women through partnerships with friendly states and international organizations. We've also delivered full food rations through airdrops and through popular community effort in host local communities, such as the city of 𝗟𝗶𝘃 in the northern state, including the experience of community kitchens. We've also strengthened cash transfer programs in safe areas and supported remittances from Sudanese abroad and supported investment in restoring supply chains and local markets. The ultimate solution lies in ending the war and protecting civilians. This cannot be achieved without bringing pressure to bear on the militia's regional sponsors to cease arming them, to stop attacks and assaults against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, we welcome the efforts of the Secretary General in the form of Mr. Lamamra and his good officers in support of efforts to resolve disputes, promote reconciliation, build confidence among the parties, facilitating negotiations, and reaching humanitarian ceasefire. That, in addition to the implementation of the Jeddah Declaration and the informal technical dialogue discussions, Sudan accepted the humanitarian truces requested by the Secretary General. However, they were rejected by the militia. Cooperation with the Secretary General's effort continue. We have facilitated between those and those of the U.S. while upholding international law and international humanitarian law. We're also enhancing civilian protection. We hope that the national plan that was submitted to the Council on the 23rd of January to protect civilians would be taken into consideration. We need to follow up on the humanitarian concerns that have intensified after the militia's occupation of the city of Al-Fashir. We look forward to the activation of Resolution 1591 concerning the arms embargo on Darfur, as regional sponsors have continued to smuggle weapons to the militia, targeting Sudan's territorial integrity and sovereignty, seeking to dismantle the state so that it becomes a prize for nomads, perpetrators and foreign mercenaries, and to impose UN sanctions upon them. Sudan will reject any expansion of the scope of Resolution 1591 and any arms embargo imposed on the Sudanese armed forces. We believe this would be a support to the militias. We believe shortcomings can be addressed by revitalizing the Jeddah Declaration, which contains commitments that can be built upon. We also stress that the government of Sudan supports and coordinates with those experts on human rights, especially with the latest visit by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The visit of His Excellency Mr. Volker to Sudan led to the meeting of more than 140 victims. It demonstrated that the testimonies regarding events in Darfur confirmed the occurrence of mass killings and summary executions, including of non-combatant civilians, prisoners, and those leaving the city in search of safety. The testimonies also included rape and sexual violence, torture, harsh treatment, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, abduction of civilians for ransom, attacks on medical service centers, mass killing of the University of Al-Fashir, and targeting on the basis of ethnic and racial identity or based on imagined racial profiling of the victim. This leads us to ensure that we will cooperate fully with all efforts to end the war, as well as with independent legal investigative mechanisms such as the ICC and Human Rights Rapporteur. Therefore, we require a firm position aimed at the following: call upon the Council and the international community to take firm measures and impose UN sanctions on the militia and its leadership. For this only prolongates the war and the suffering. We have to put an end to the efforts of the militia and the foreign mercenary advocates. We have to persuade the regional sponsor to cease supplying the rebel militia with weapons and advanced drones. We have to stop the recruitment of foreign mercenaries from any country. We need to take punitive action against perpetrators. We have to support the voluntary return of refugees and the IDPs. We should support Sudan's peace initiative, which calls for civilian protection, and designate the militia as a terrorist group based on the genocide committed in Al-Fashir, and condemn parties that continue to introduce weapons, supplies, drones, and to deploy mercenaries and foreign fighters despite claiming support for a political solution, thereby prolonging the war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Sudan for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, at the outset, I would like to welcome Her Excellency, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom. And I would also like to welcome Mr. Masad Boulos, the advisor to the U.S. President. And we would also like to thank the United Kingdom for including the issue of Sudan on the ministerial debates program at this critical juncture. We would also like to thank the briefers led by Ms. 𝗟𝗃, the USG for Political and Peace-Building Affairs. And we thank all the briefers for their detailed insights that have highlighted the political and humanitarian challenges in Sudan. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the situation in Sudan requires all of us to work in the spirit of cooperation and solidarity to end the crisis. The Sudanese people face unbearable challenges represented by multiple things, including the tragic insecurity and food insecurity and the lack of the most basic requirements for daily life. There is no doubt, Mr. President, that the serious humanitarian consequences are a direct result of targeting the unity of Sudan and its state institutions, leading to an expanded conflict throughout the country. Despite the promises in Jeddah and the Security Council resolutions, including 2730, 2286, and 2791, these resolutions are clear and that cannot be misinterpreted. Mr. President, my country condemns in the most harsh of terms the criminal attacks by the RSF against the Quick Military Hospital and the WFP activities and a bus of civilian passengers through drone attacks that have led to the killing of dozens of civilians, including women and children, as well as targeting humanitarian convoys in Kordofan. These heinous acts cannot be justified in any way. Therefore, we call on everyone to abide by their moral and humanitarian obligations to and secure humanitarian access as per international law. Mr. President, my country's efforts have begun since the start of the crisis to end the crisis in Sudan through the Jeddah negotiations and the continued efforts with friendly and sisterly nations, including the United States. And in this context, we thank the efforts of the U.S. administration and the envoy 𝗟𝗏𝘃𝗲 to end the conflict, and we express our appreciation for the efforts led by the U.S. to reach a humanitarian truce and a comprehensive resolution in Sudan. There is no doubt that humanitarian access is one of the critical priorities for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and here we welcome the efforts of the government to open the Adri crossing and emphasize the need for access to all those who need assistance as per international humanitarian law and as per the Jeddah Declaration of May 11th, 2023 and the relevant Security Council resolutions. The Quad remains an element to support the political process that is purely Sudanese and to create the conditions for a sustained settlement. We also applaud the role of regional actors, including the African Union, the League of Arab States, as well as the UN envoy, Mr. 𝗟𝗏𝘃𝗲, who all of these roles remain essential to address this conflict. Mr. President, since the start of the crisis, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, based on its moral responsibility, has implemented evacuation operations that have evacuated Saudi nationals as well as other nationals since the beginning. And the number of persons who have been evacuated reached 8,455 persons from 110 states, which is an embodiment of the Kingdom's commitment to international solidarity. We have also presented